So now we are starting with week 3. And in week 3, we are going to look into hooks. It'll cover up building custom hooks. And we'll also start looking into use effect more. We covered a little bit part of use effect. We even covered how the dependency array of the use effect works. And in this video, we're going to see how we have to do effect cleanups in use effect. We'll also see how to make a custom hook. And probably if we have time, we'll cover up some third-party UI libraries. But I think I've already covered the third-party UI libraries in one of the QA sessions, and the video is also up there. We used Bootstrap for this because somebody had started asking, and we just changed buttons to Bootstrap buttons and so on. That is going to be the simple part, but I'm going to focus more on hooks. And for this, we are going to start making an app, which will be a basic, simple stopwatch app. We will show the current count. If I click on start, then the count will keep incrementing every second. And so if I press stop, the count will stop. Let's go and start coding it. I am going to declare a new component called Stopwatch. And we are not going to take any props, and probably I want to render it here where my app actually renders. Right, so far nothing should be anything different than what we have done. I'm going to do a return and put a div around here, and this is the place where we're going to show count. So I'm going to make this a variable, const count is equal to 0 initially, and I'm going to just put the variable count in here. And now we can see we have a 0 there. We also need 2 buttons to start and stop. We can start adding them. And I'm just doing this so that I have places for putting the button. Right. Now we have a count, and maybe I can put button as well. Button start and another button to simply stop. Now, before we even begin on how to start and stop on a button, let's try to focus on how we can just increment this variable 0 every second. Now, if you know in JavaScript, there is already a function to do this. It's called setInterval. Maybe you have seen setTimeout before. And what setTimeout does is it takes a function. Let's say we have a function here, console log hello. And then we give a duration after how much seconds it should run this function, or after how much milliseconds. So we're going to give 1000, and that means it will run this function after 1 second. Let me go and try to do it on a console so that I can show you. And if I zoom in, now it should be pretty visible. So now here we have set timeout. It takes a function. This function is doing nothing but just doing a console log of hello, and it will run after 1 second. And after 1 second, we see hello. Similarly, we have set interval. And what this will do is it'll keep executing this function after every 1 second. So it's an interval that we define, and after that, during each interval, it'll keep executing the same function over and over again. So let's see how that works. So we had hello, and now if you see, the count of hello is increasing because after each second it is incrementing. It's again calling this function, and we are logging it, and hence the log count keeps on increasing. So we can start using this set interval to increment our variable here. And I think I have covered this before. Set interval is also exactly not part of the JavaScript API. It is implemented separately in the DOM API or in the browser API, and even in Node, it is implemented but as a separate than the core JavaScript. And if anything we want to run that is not core JavaScript, like DOM manipulations, intervals, fetching data, all of those goes in use effect. So I'm going to simply write a use effect here, and use effect again takes a function. So I'm going to put this empty. And the dependency, I'm going to just say run this whatever effect I'm going to give here only at the start. And here I can go and put set interval. And I can say for each second, run something. Now, what will this something be? Here, we somehow want to keep incrementing this variable. And again, if inside the component we want to change anything with the variable and render it, we're going to use state. So let's just raise this to a state, and I'm going to say count and set count. And I'm going to put a use state here. Now this becomes a stateful variable. Let me move this line just above use effect so I can start using the set count in here. And I will go and say set count will be whatever the value of count comes, add 1 to that. I hope this would make sense. We have a count variable here, which is initially set to 0, and we have a set count to increment this. In the use effect, I'm saying on the interval of 1 second or 1000 millisecond, do something, and that something is keep on incrementing the count. So hopefully once it runs, we can start seeing the count being incremented. And let me try and refresh this page. We saw it incremented from 0 to 1, but it paused after that. Let me show you this again on the bigger screen. So it goes from 0, it goes till 1, and then stops. It is not incrementing any further. Let's refresh and see that again. Now, this may seem like there is some sort of a bug in here. Like, why is this variable not increasing? It increased, it was initially 0, it went 0. After 1 second, it will go to 1, which it went. And after that, it just completely paused. And we are running this effect only once, right? Because this is set interval, and it will automatically keep on repeating itself after each second, since we gave it 1000 millisecond time. If we try to start looking what this variable actually is, let me go and log this variable. I'm going to log count, and rather I want to log the count when it is inside this interval, because I want to see why is it not increasing. Let me open my console. I can see that, oh, there are 2 intervals running, so let's refresh everything. I can see the variable is coming as 2, but it's still not incrementing, and it is fluctuating between 0 and 2 always. Again, if I refresh everything, I have that variable, but it's incrementing, but it's shifting back to 0 again. And that says there's something wrong about this. And what is happening is something called stale closures. Stale closures here refer to this variable value count. Whenever it is captured inside of this function, it always acts as if it was 0. So in the first run, we render it as 0. In the second time, it gets incremented here and it shows 1. The next time when it comes, it's again the value is 0. It is still not clearly showing in here. Why? Because let me see. Since there are 2 intervals running, because I just refreshed the page, now it's jumping till 2, but that is not going to be correct. And once I refresh, I think everything should be back to normal. So we can see this variable is always 0, right? We are logging the count variable here, and it's always 0 when it is inside of here. It is initially 0, it gets back to 1. Then when it comes inside of this function again, it is 0. And this is because the function captures the value of count, and it always has an old value, and thus we call it stale value. And this becomes a stale closure. Closure is anything that's created between brackets, and this in between brackets, we have a very old value of count. It's not taking the latest, most updated value of the count. Hence, this thing is called as a stale closure. If you go on Google and you search stale closure React, you'll find plenty of articles. Beware of stale closures, how to avoid stale closures, what is the problem with them, and it's a good read. But the whole concept is the value here is not getting updated. It'll be constantly 0. And that is something odd. Even if when we are doing set count, it is not changing. Why? Because these brackets always will hold the old value. So to fix this, we can simply go and say the count is coming as a function, and I have shown it before that the set state variable can also take a function which will come from the previous value of the state to the new value of the state. And I'm just saying whatever the old count was, increment it to new count. I am going to refresh again, and always refresh because the hot reloading really doesn't work. Now we can see the variable is incrementing every time. Why? Because we are taking the old value from the state. There is no variable that we have captured in the stale closure. This is always giving us the last value that the state had, and we are directly incrementing it. If we directly use count here, this will keep us showing old values. Let me just console refresh this. Yeah, on the console, the count is still getting the old values, which are 0, but we are referring to the old state, which is coming from inside of React, because the set count variable, the set count function, can either take the new state. We can just do here count plus 1, or it can take a function that gives us the previous state, and this is the freshest previous state available. This is not a variable that has been inside of a stale closure. And we can go and increment that old count. And always refresh, because if you have multiple intervals running on hot reloading, multiple intervals start running together. So at least we fixed this problem, that whenever we want to change the count, we can put it in an interval, and we can say only run the interval once. Let me also show you one more error that React was giving. If I give here count, this thing becomes red, which means that there is certain amount of error here. And if we look at that, it says it has a missing dependency either included, or you can also use it as a function update, which says set count C and something. So that's what we did. We made it a functional update. And React errors are pretty helpful. Please read them properly. I'll show that error message again. It says that either we are missing a dependency on count because we are capturing a stale value of count, as we saw that it's always 0, even though we are trying to update it. Or the other thing is that we can use a functional update where we take the old state, which how they are showing set count will take a C, which is like the old count, and we can increment that old count. So I'm going to start putting the old count function back. And again, refresh, because hot reloading will crash your multiple running interval events. So now everything works here fine, but we somehow need to control that when we click on the start button, then only it starts, or initially it should be 0. So I can again make a state here, and I'm gonna say is stopwatch running. And since it needs an accompanying function, I'm gonna say set stopwatch running. And initially we don't want our stopwatch to run, so I'm gonna say use state and give it false. And now I can say that whenever I start, I can say my stopwatch is running, and I can set that as true. And similarly, when I stop, I can say stopwatch is running, and I can put it false. Let me make this slightly bigger. All right, we did nothing here. We just made another state variable just to capture if the stopwatch is currently running or not. And on the click of the start button, we want to set the stopwatch to be running. And on the click of the stop button, we want to pause it. Now, what can I do with this? Well, the first thing I can really go and do is here say that if the stopwatch is running, then only run my effect. That should be making a bit of a sense. And as soon as we do that, we see that there is another error, and we should start reading the React error seriously. So it says that the React hook use effect is missing a dependency is stopwatch running, because we are dependent on this value inside of our use effect. We are trying to make a decision if the use effect is stopwatch running, true or false. Depending on that, we are running our effect. So I'm going to just put it here as a dependency, because whenever this value changes, we want to recompute that should we be doing interval or not. So now our stopwatch isn't actually running because is stopwatch running is initially false, and if this is false, then this won't execute and the effect did not execute. As soon as I press start, now this value becomes true, which means that this block of code can now evaluate, and this could reevaluate only because I put is stopwatch running as a dependency. And now we have our stopwatch running. Notice that the stop button is not really stopping it or doing anything. So I'm going to just go and refresh. I want to first show you if I don't put this dependency, what happens. So again, we have 0, and the stopwatch is not running. Initial state of the count is 0, and the stopwatch is not running because the initial value is false. As soon as I press start, nothing is going to happen because this is not going to re-execute. This block of code has only executed once because we gave it an empty array. As soon as I put this variable here, whenever this variable changes, this effect can run on its own. So I am going to refresh it. Now I press start. Since the count initially was 0, this variable changed from false to true, which means this effect will run again. And when this runs again, here the value becomes true, which means this can now execute. And we can see it is running. The next challenge comes in how do we stop it, right? If it is true, then do something else. Stop the watch or stop the interval essentially, right? And stopping the interval, we have to figure out how to do it. JavaScript luckily comes with a function to do it. Let me go on this page and let me refresh it because we had an interval running here for almost 5 minutes. I'm going to put this code again on the top, and this code will be printing hello for every second. So if I put that, I'm getting hello, and every second it's getting more and more hello to the console, and hence this counter is increasing. But if you also notice, we get this 77 random value, right? I'll show it again. I'm gonna go refresh the page because there's already an interval running and I don't want to run multiple intervals. Now the number is not 77 but 68. So this is like some random ID that we are getting to know what this interval is. And if I go, you can see the interval is running. It's increasing every second. It's logging hello. If I go and put clear interval, and I put this magic number 68 that we got, our interval has stopped. Let me show this again. I go and start another interval. This time the number we got was 70. So I'm gonna put 70 in here. and it has stopped. So the clear interval takes an ID, and this ID comes from the initial ID of the interval. So the number 70 here was the initial interval ID, and clear interval will take that ID and will completely clear out that interval process. It'll stop that interval. This will never happen again. The interval gets completely removed from the JavaScript call stack. So how can we get this variable? Well, it is pretty simple. Instead of this, I'm going to assign it to a variable. I'm going to call it var interval ID is equal to something. And we can see the hello being clogged over and over and over again. And I can just go clear interval on interval ID. And it has paused. So basically the set interval, and similarly for set timeout as well. Set timeout, if I just take this function and call it set timeout, this will also return an ID. Here it's returning us 72. But anyway, we can use this clear interval function and pass it the interval ID and clear it. And that interval ID is given to us whenever we create an interval. Now that we know that, we can use this to pause our stopwatch. So I'm going to go back to the code. Somehow I need to put this var interval ID is equal to this. And here I need to do clear interval and put the interval ID here. The issue is this interval ID variable is blocked just in this scope and we can't really access it here. One way is I could raise this interval ID up here and I can just mutate the variable, and so let's use let, because let tells us that this variable can be mutated. So initially it's null. When the stopwatch runs, we take the set interval, we assign the interval ID from the set interval to the interval ID variable. And when everything is stopped, when the stopwatch is not running, we can go and stop the interval. So let's go and run this. I'm going to refresh the browser. Let me show you on the bigger browser. If I do start, it increments 1, 2, 3, 4, so on. And if I press stop, again, nothing is happening for now. So this brings us to an important part in use effect. Whenever we want to stop an effect, we have to return a function that will help us stop that effect. So now, instead of this, if I just return a function, again, mark my words, return a function. So I'm going to return a function, and all that function will do is clear interval ID. And I'm going to pass it an interval ID. Let's refresh and see that again. So now that I start, the variable increases from 1, 2, 3, 4, so on. And if I press stop, it has paused. Why? Why this happens is when use effect finishes, it executes this line. And we have told the use effect to again stop or start or finish its effect because this variable changed. Since this variable changed, use effect wanted to finish itself, and if we give it a function, here the function is to clear the interval, it will go on and execute always the function that it returns. That is by design how use effect has been designed. If you return a function at the end, it will run it at the end when it has done everything. This is also called as React use effect cleanup. If you go and Google for that, hooks effect cleanup and stuff like that, you will find a lot of articles, and even there are videos use effect with cleanups. I would definitely recommend to watch some of those videos. Let's look at it again. Once I press start, Or actually, let's start from the beginning. Initially, our count is 0 and our stopwatch is really not running, right? So when we go into this effect, this value is false, which means this value is false, nothing is running. This also code doesn't run because the use effect is not executing anything. As soon as I press start, let's keep looking at here. As soon as I press start, this value becomes true, which means this becomes true, which means this will execute again. Remember, whenever this variable will change, the use effect will execute again. Since this value is true, which means our interval will start running and we'll get this interval ID that we wanted to set in a variable. We are only setting it outside because we want to use it outside of the if scope. And now if I press stop, which means that this variable has changed, which means the use effect will run again, but before it runs again, the previous use effect will execute this as a cleanup. And this is automatically done by React. If you return a function from use effect, once the use effect is getting cleaned up or it's getting changed, it gets executed. Once this gets executed, we stop our interval. And once we stop the interval, our count becomes stable at whatever count it was.